If I could invite Dominic Foote to the table, please. We're on exactly the same topic, which is around affordable housing and inclusive housing. Dominic, welcome. You're appearing today. You're a member of the New Zealand Housing Foundation, but you are appearing on behalf, I think, of community housing providers.
That's correct.
5 minutes and then questions to you as well.
Thank you. Kia ora koutou. I'm Dominic Foote, General Manager of the New Zealand Housing Foundation. I'm here representing the Auckland Community Housing Network providers. Now, we're a coalition of 20 or so community housing providers in Auckland. And to date, we've assisted about 6,000 households, which is tiny when you consider the housing need in Auckland. But we're a growing organisation, we're a growing network, and our focus is on providing social and affordable housing, and housing that is delivered in a blind mixed tenure environment. Blind mixed tenure, for those who aren't aware, basically means it's housing where if you walk down the street, you would not have a clue whether it's privately owned, privately rented, lived in by a social housing tenant, lived in a community housing property. It is not known, you cannot tell. And we've taken councillors, ministers to several developments, and we've played the game, which house on the street do you think this is? And they haven't been able to tell. So we know that blind mixed tenure works, and that's really one of our core values around what we do. We also work on the premise of affordability being based on household incomes, not on a discount to market price. Discount to market price isn't affordable. It isn't. It's not an affordability benchmark.
Can you repeat that comment? Just
sorry, if we can close that door, there's a bit of noise coming in from outside. Dominic?
And I'll slow down as well. I won't speak so fast yet. And I've got quite a low voice, so apologies if you don't pick up what I'm saying. So we work on the basis of affordability being determined by what a family, a household, a person can afford to pay for their housing costs. Affordability being benchmarked at or around 30% of their gross income. That's an internationally accepted benchmark, and it's one that isn't enshrined in legislation here or in many other jurisdictions overseas, but it's used as a policy benchmark for affordability. Frequently, though, that we hear the words affordability being driven by market price or discount to market price. That isn't affordable to people. That is just a different house price for a different property or similar property in the market. So we work on the basis of affordability and creating communities through blind mixed tenure and offering households a range of tenures. The focus for the Housing Foundation, community housing providers, both in Auckland and across the country, is that there's a concern that we're starting to get now where we're seeing high concentrations of housing being delivered that is of one tenure. Traditionally, one tenure usually means it's privately owned. But what we're starting to see now is high concentrations of just social housing being delivered and then being balanced by expensive, high-price, open market housing. The consequence of delivering housing like that means that people who live in that existing community, if they're too rich rather to be in social housing and too poor to afford the new housing, are excluded. They move. They are forcibly moved out to areas where there is higher levels or greater levels of affordability. They become marginalised, and those areas become marginalised. Families who are able to stay in the community, they do so either through crowding or through living or moving into smaller properties that are possibly of lesser quality. So we do have concerns about high concentrations. We work as an organisation and as a network and collectively across the country on working on a balance of housing tenure spread through a new development or spread through a community. Achieving that balance isn't sort of a wet finger in the air approach. It's not a rule of thumb. You've got to get in and know the community. You've got to get in and understand the housing needs. So before we go anywhere, we normally look at the community, we look at the stats, we look at census, we talk to community organisations, we talk to local marae, we talk to businesses, we talk to schools. We get a general sense of what the housing need looks like in that community now and what the housing need could look like in the future going forward. Inevitably, we end up with a range of tenure percentages. So if we're looking at social rental, we usually sit around the 20 to 30%. And one of the reasons for that is frequently where the community housing sector finds its land is adjacent to or within existing social rental areas. So the desire of ourselves and of the Crown is not to increase the numbers of units there, but actually to provide greater choice. We also then provide housing that's affordable, which is what I talked about, based on income. The number of affordable houses that we offer, properties, apartments, sits usually around the 20 to 40%. And then we also believe in providing a range of private houses for private owners. Houses that we will deliver as a network that are competitively priced into the community. So we don't go for highest and best use, highest value and best use. We go for housing that's needed in the community, that's affordable in the community, and that we know can be delivered within the community. There is a small letter that we have issued to Democracy Services for yourselves to read post this forum. There are initiatives currently underway that will address some level of affordability, and KiwiBuild is one of them, and we support KiwiBuild. We support anything that adds to the housing supply in Auckland and nationally. But if you look at the work that the Chief Economist for Auckland did, it really only will support and assist households who are on $100,000 or more. Yeah. So I think the Chief Economist said that a household that can raise a 20% deposit on a $649,000 property, so that's $130,000 of deposit, will still need $110,000 of income to service the mortgage. Now, as a result of that work, several reports have come out that indicate there's about 200,000, well, maybe up to 200,000 households in Auckland that are not going to benefit from KiwiBuild, cannot afford to stay in the open market, and are too wealthy to be in the social rental market. That's the sector that we're dealing with. That's the sector that we're supporting. That's the sector that we want to see increased housing supply going into. But it's also the sector that currently the Crown has little appetite and it's got no policy development in that area. So what we're saying is that we believe that there is a role, and we know that through the Mayoral Housing Task Force, this is underway, and this is really to support the work that's underway in the task force, is that we believe that council has several roles here. It's got an influencing role, so inclusionary zoning, which several of you will have known about from 2 or 3 years ago when it was voted out by council. And that's a stunningly good opportunity to provide affordable housing, and it's frankly embarrassing that it wasn't delivered on, but it didn't happen. But the opportunity is not lost, it's still there. There's also the opportunity through its land, and as John Tamahiri mentioned, and as we all know, Panuku has land. It's got land. We're part of a coalition of housing providers that has bought land from council recently to provide up to 300 properties for a range of social, affordable and private housing. That's in Manukau. And we know that will be a success, and that's going to be delivered on a blind 10-year basis. And that is part of Transform Manukau. So it's going to be the first housing development in Transform Manukau. It will be a catalyst for Transform Manukau. It will be a catalyst for bringing people into the community. So we can operate and we can work with council on its key assets in its areas where you can unlock or transform a region, an area. Because by doing that, we don't see housing markets go up or go down. Our housing market is 200,000 people. We actually can't deliver to that ourselves. It's a constant. So all we can do is meet that need, that demand. So even though the market's flat and developers don't want to buy land or build, we can still do that. So we can be part of that catalytic movement within council to drive change in communities. But we will only be part of that movement if we can actually be part of a mixed tenure environment. So to conclude, what I'd like to say is that the Auckland Community Housing Network supports the role of council, supports the Mayoral Housing Task Force, supports the work it's doing, but certainly wants to see greater action, greater commitment, and also desire to actually achieve change, to maintain and keep communities as they are, and not to see sort of communities and people being excluded from them because they can't afford to stay. Thank you.
Dominic?
Thank you very much, Dominic. I think that was a very helpful contribution, both to the discussion we've just had and the discussion we're going to have on Councillor Casey's notice of motion. It addresses, you're nicely positioned between the two discussions. I'm happy to move the motion of thanks, seconded by Councillor Casey, and we'll take some questions. Councillor Cooper.
Thank you. And I mean, it's such a shame that the media and the audience haven't stayed to hear another view, unfortunately. Thank you. My question is a little bit, it's actually Councillor Hulse's question from earlier that wasn't answered. I know my experience of blind mixed tenure is in my own community, and I've just last week been, this is to preface the question, Vision West do a lot of work in this area, and as one of your members of the Housing Alliance, you know, they just opened five homes, dwellings, and a beautiful terrace in a mixed Ngāti Whātua Fletcher development in Massey. And here's 7 people who have intellectual disability and some physical disability getting their first home for themselves, but they're provided with wraparound care, and it's tailored to each couple or person. So I guess that's, for me, is that what's your view around, you know, if you've got often people that might have come for drug programs, they might have alcohol problems, they're often single men that have come out of prison, a whole lot of things like this, which we need to have homes for these people. What's your view around the level of pastoral care they need, or wraparound care, in terms of that? Can people just be left in huge developments to their own devices if they need support? You know, they're not getting it. What are the outcomes if we don't do that?
So the evidence is clear. It's not just research evidence, it's clear by what you see in communities. People who are now coming through, certainly into social housing, are coming through with far more complex and higher levels of need than ever before. The focus of social housing is rightly on those most in need. And that is usually first to get the house, to get the shelter, to get the roof over their head. But beyond that, they do need that level of support, that care. And that care is always tailored, it's personalised, it's individual. Without it, all our providers that are part of the network, Vision West, Accessible, Monty, Court, and the others, they know that if that care isn't provided, the family, the person, the household is not going to cope, is not going to stay in the home, and is likely to leave. So it's incredibly important. So
just last question, thank you. So following on from that, so I think probably the answer is how well do Housing New Zealand do that? I mean, this is not to be pejorative, but just, you know, if it's just all sold to Housing New Zealand, how does that work out for people?
So I take the long-term view on this. So you can tell I'm English, I'm from the UK. The Crown there doesn't own housing, it's predominantly owned by housing associations. So the political influence is removed, and the problem that Housing New Zealand has, and it's I know a lot of people there, I've got good friends, and they are absolutely brilliant in their job. Government policy changes. Doesn't matter, it's a fact, it changes. And when it changes, and money changes. Operational costs get changed, they go up or go down, but they get changed. As a consequence, the first thing that gets hit is the frontline costs, the frontline support that's needed. That's the problem. So if you take a long-term view, I don't doubt now that Housing New Zealand will go in there and do absolutely the right thing. They wouldn't do this without doing that. But whether they can be guaranteed to be doing that in 10 years or not, I don't know. I wouldn't put my money on it. But I'll put my money on a community housing provider doing that in 10 years.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Councillor John Watson.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Thank you, Dominic. Just a comment, or a question, I should say, about your comments on inclusionary zoning. You're aware, of course, that the hearings panel and the council accepted the view of the likes of Housing New Zealand that affordability best addressed through different typologies and greater production. You're very much of the view, I take it, that the inclusionary zoning would have more effect than what we've seen thus far in terms of these range and supply of housing and addressing the affordability issue.
Yeah, absolutely. We were in the bizarre situation of facing Housing New Zealand at the hearings panel. So I presented along with others around the reason why we should have affordable housing and why we should have inclusionary zoning. And Housing New Zealand took a different position. We, as the Housing Foundation, have benefited from inclusionary zoning through the special housing areas that were created. So we've built 40-odd houses for low-income households on land that was owned by Hugh Green and by other organised developers in Auckland. Without that SHAR requirement, we wouldn't be there. So, and we couldn't afford to be there either. But we are there. So we know that by reality and by absolute practice it works. So we do think it makes a difference.
So that's a good question. The developer can adjust and it doesn't result in costs being spread elsewhere, as we were told during those hearings.
Oh, the developer doesn't like it. That's but there's a degree of pragmatism. They got a higher level of density as a result of that. And when they, we know Hugh Green Group well now, and as when they got to understand how it worked, they actually saw two benefits coming through this. One was pre-sales. You know, they got pre-sales, and certainly in a diving market, that's good for them. And secondly, they knew that we were there looking after the families in there, because a lot of pre-sales to developers are often bought by investors, and they rent them out, and then the developer has difficulty on selling the land afterwards. So they actually saw some real benefits coming through, but financially, they wouldn't have reaped the benefits if it had all been privately owned.
Great, thank you. Deputy Mayor Cashmore.
Well, thanks. Just three very quick questions, Dominic. I love hearing from people who are actually at the coalface, so thank you for that. Firstly, your inclusionary zoning would stay for the lifetime of the house?
Well, yes. So in the Shire there are two provisions. We disagree with the first one, which time limits it to 3 years, because then there's actually an economic gain to the person who buys that. The other one is retained, and retained affordable housing, I think in Shire, is for 50 years. And it has to be owned by a community housing provider.
Yep.
So, and that's the one that we support.
Cool. The second point is the mixed housing model, the third, that you think creates good social outcomes in your experience?
When well planned, when well thought through, and when you understand the community that you're putting it into, absolutely. We have the evidence through a development that we were involved in Waimea here. Two pieces of research have come out from there, and the third's coming out shortly, and it shows through independent research the benefits that the households see through living in that environment. And we're very open. We tell private buyers, you are moving into a mixed tenure development. You may live next to a social rental household. You may live next to a shared owner. So they do know.
Yeah. And my last question, Mr. Mayor, if you allow me, is purely about the economics of building these things. So we need more social housing. Does that third enable a greater build, in your opinion?
You can't do affordable housing without some level of subsidy sitting in there somewhere. Yeah. That's
yep,
an
that's
inherent,
money,
self-evident fact. It does help. It helps us when we do private housing. It certainly helps us. It helps us to take the profit, the surplus that comes out of the private sales, to get back into the affordable housing. The social rental housing is fully funded by the Crown through rents, so that's doable. It's the affordable housing that is just not funded.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks. Very good points. Thank you very much, Don.
Thank you very much. Councillor Josephine Bartley, last question.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, and through you. Thank you, Dominic. I think what you're saying is really valuable, and I do agree with Councillor Cooper that it's a pity the media are so shallow that they didn't stick around for it.
Except Todd.
Oh, except for Todd. Sorry, Todd.
Of course.
No
pressure, Todd. It's going to be a good story.
I want to pick up on your comments about the ones that we're seeing that are stuck in the middle. I see it in Tamaki. It's the ones that are working, that have been reassessed out of a state house, that can't afford private rental, so they have to move out to West Auckland and South Auckland to get something they can afford.
Exactly right.
What can we do? Is it that the government needs to start providing affordable rentals, not affordable housing, but affordable rentals, or what role does council have in that space?
That is clearly the missing tenure in Tamaki, affordable rentals, and also assisted ownership, shared ownership, which is what we do. So we're actually building now in Tamaki, 70 odd houses, but we did the deal with TRC on the basis that we would do a third of them as affordable for our products, and we got that across the line. So we're doing almost 18 houses there, which is tiny for the need. The affordable housing, it can only really be provided on Crown land if the Crown is prepared to take a hit on the land, or is prepared to put some form of capital grant up front. But if it puts money into it, we always sign an agreement with the government that when that family moves on, or that house is purchased through shared ownership, that money is recycled back into that community again. It's never lost. It's always there for the purposes of affordable housing. But the government currently, I fully understand why, is focused on KiwiBuild and getting that initiative across the line. So in short, we need affordable rental, we need affordable housing.
Because the same is going to happen over in Mangere with the development there, Onehunga, Oranga, wherever HRC's got a development, they're going to have the same issue because those families that are in those current state houses will be reassessed out. So it's not just a Tamaki issue, it is going to be Auckland-wide. And there's no solution.
I might be able to help you, councillor, because when we launched in Mount Roskill a couple of weeks ago, I asked that question specifically with a particular affection for that community. What guarantee have you got that people who were living in this community will be able to return or stay in this community? And the answer I got was 100% guarantee, and that's the way it should be, because regeneration should not mean gentrification. Absolutely clear on that. Dominic, if I can put the last question to you, you talked about doing 20% social housing. You generally kept it at that level, 40% affordable, and then maybe 40% market private homes. Have you ever felt under any threat that you may be in breach of the Human Rights Act, or that you were a social engineer because of your decisions?
No, because we work on the basis that we think this is the appropriate housing mix into the community.
So
we've
you
never
don't see your actions in any way, because this would apply, the Human Rights Act doesn't discriminate between the public and the private sector. Your decision for a mixed tenure, mixed income community, what's your view that you may be in breach of the Human Rights Act?
I think if anything, we'd be supporting the Human Rights Act in the sense of providing shelter for people who don't have shelter.
So you don't think you're in breach of it because you've made the decision for mixed tenure and mixed income?
No, we don't think we are.
No. And I think that you're right, and your predecessor in presentation was wrong. Look, thank you very much. Sorry, we've got a last question. This always happens to me.
I'm interested in the blind tenure test, and
Yeah.
Councillor Hulse and I have been talking about this. So if a development was, say, 70% as proposed social housing, or 100% as proposed on one of the blocks, Tavern Lane, do you think you could take a group there and get them to pass the blind tenure test when the actual development, they don't know it, but they're looking at it, is at that, in that mix of 70 to 100%? Do you think you could get them to pass that blind tenure test?
So what people look to first is actually the what you'd call the street side appeal. So in the first few years, it probably wouldn't look anything. It will look just like a development block, and depending how well it's managed, I don't think people would know the tenure of the people in the apartments. But over time, yeah, I think you would notice that it was certainly a development, because buildings like that do need a reasonable high level of capital investment to maintain them, you know, to keep them looking good, to keep them looking how they should look. And as a result of people living in those homes, when they know that there's care given to their home by the owner of the property, they're more likely to look after it. When care isn't shown by the owner of the property and it starts to fall into disrepair, repainting programs get put about 5 years, broken doors aren't fixed for 5 weeks. The average person in that property is going to think, well, if they don't care, why should I care? And that's where you see that cycle starting to occur. It varies, the extremity of it varies, but it still does happen.
Thank you, Dominic.
Great. Dominic, thank you very much, not only for your presentation today, but for the excellent work that the members of the community housing providers do. Your absolute commitment to a better society and a fairer go, not only for social housing providers, but for that group that I think you drew our attention to, that earn too much to get help through social housing, but don't earn enough ever to realise their dream, which is home ownership, and you help realise that dream for so many people. So thank you very much, and I'll put the motion. All those in favour, please say aye.
Aye.
And to the contrary, carried. Thank you very much, Dominic.
Thank you.